Welcome back to the Manage to Win podcast. We actually have a great podcast for you today. Before I dive in there, I want to talk about Habitly.com. If you haven't checked it out, all of us need to have better awareness of what our strengths and weaknesses are behaviorally, how we interact with people, how we manage our time, how we set and achieve goals. Okay. These are all important, how we avoid conflict, how we resolve conflict, etc. Habitly.com has some great courses, and it's really dirt cheap. So I encourage you to think as an individual or as a group. Check out Habitly.com. You even get the first 7 days free. You can't go wrong. So try it out. It is a great place to learn how to be your best. Now, our guest today is Matt Tenney. He's the author of the book, Serve to Be Great, Leadership Lessons from a Prison, a Monastery, and a Boardroom. Now, I was really interested in the prison and the monastery. We had a great conversation with some powerful tips that you can apply to better manage your time so you're focusing on building assets, as Matt says, and also mindfulness and how that's just changed his life. Let's dive in. This is great. Matt, I am curious about your background in prison or prisons. That doesn't mean you went to prison. I do not know anything yet. And a monastery. But also, you've got this 4-step leadership system that you say is like ironclad, the best thing ever. Where do you want to start in this conversation?
It's a great question. Well, maybe we start with this a very high level overview of the 4-step process, and then I think the conversation will kind of naturally come back to its roots, which are derived from experiences in prison and a monastery, and eventually a boardroom.
Okay, cool. Let's dive in.
So the process is super, super simple, and the first step sounds almost too obvious, right? And it's that I think we as leaders need to be frequently reminded of what our true job is, because we tend to get caught up in the execution of tasks. We tend to get caught up in short-term metrics, and we forget that if we have a leadership position, our true job is to simply inspire greatness in our team. And I think a lot of people hear that and they think, well, that sounds like some lofty aspiration. Only a natural born leader can do that, which just simply isn't true. There's actually a process to this, which is what this process helps with, is how you can consistently inspire greatness in one's team. And the second step is if you understand that that's one's job as a leader, then it logically flows that the next thing we need to do is identify what do people need to be great, and consistently meet those needs and remove obstacles to people being great. And then the third step logically flows from that, which is, well, we need, once we've identified those needs, we need to get regular feedback on how well we're doing. And the fourth step logically flows from that, which we need to respond to that feedback very quickly, right? To show people that we actually care about the feedback that they're giving us.
So when you're talking about feedback they're giving you as a person that you're managing or interacting.
Correct. Yeah, I think 360s have their place, in the world of business. But I believe that if you're a leader, the most important feedback comes from the people you serve as a leader, the people that report directly to you. They're going to give you what you need to find more meaning in your work and to be more effective as a leader.
So where does it play into your system? Because I don't think any of that works unless you actually like people and you like the people that you're working with.
What do you mean? Can you expand on that?
Well, if I don't like somebody who's on my team, or I don't truly believe in them, how am I going to help them truly be great?
Well, I think that's, you don't have to like a person to serve a person and to love that person. Right. I mean, if you have two motives to help anybody, whether you like them or not, to be great. So there's the selfish motivation, which doesn't work, right? But this is what many people get stuck in. The selfish leader, they want greatness out of their team. They want high performance out of their team so that they can look good, right? So that they can get a promotion or get more prestige or just look good in front of the boss. And people feel that immediately. It's repulsive. Right. But the other motivation is, I know that if I help a person to be great, that's what's best for them. Like nobody wants to be mediocre. Nobody wants to show up and be terrible at work every day, but it happens all the time out of bad habits. So I have two motives. There's the kind of selfish motive, which is okay to have part of that in your motivation, right? Which is, well, I'd like to keep my job. And to do that, I need a team that's performing well. I need individuals who are performing well, and I need people to work well together as a team. That's kind of like the basic job description for being a manager, right? So you have that motivation. But then you also have the motivation of, well, whether I like a person or not, adding value in somebody's life is what gives life meaning. I mean, this is truly like, this is what we know deep down inside is what makes life rich. And I think there's actually something too, when you add value in the life of somebody who you don't particularly like, that makes it even more meaningful. It's easy to be nice and take care of the people that you love and that love you. It's a little bit harder to do that with people that you don't like, right? So if you can extend yourself for that person, that brings even more meaning, in my view, to one's work as a leader.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether your prison and monastery piece kind of are the rock or part of the rock that these four cornerstones you're calling steps are built on, because I agree with you. There's always some type of self-motivation. I want my team to achieve X, or I want to receive this bonus, or I want to keep my job, but then there's this other thing that we're going into here that I think it's very difficult to do your four steps unless you truly, sincerely want to see this person succeed. And so you are, how do I make you great? By coincidence, I just got off a call with a guy who reports to me. Mm-hmm. So I manage about 110 people, and he just got promoted, got moved into my team. And he asked me at the end, his name's Prashant, a great guy. He said, what can I do to help you? You're doing things to help me. What can I do to help you? I said, well, quite frankly, I just want you to be successful. If you're successful, that's meaningful to me. I want you to have the best year you've ever had. It also helps me in that, your team's doing well. And so that looks good. But my primary thing is I just, if this can be your best year, if you can do great, then, I'm fine. You don't have to do anything for me. Just focus on developing your skills, giving your team the support. And for me, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe you've got a different aspect here, which I'm open to, that just kind of opened things up, and I view him as a friend as well as a peer. So I'm glad to have him, but it enables me that I can easily focus on how do I make this person great? Your first step. But what do you think? Is that like a necessary item where you really sincerely care about the person? Or is it something where it's like, I may not totally care about the person, but I can still help make them great?
No, absolutely. I think you can care about somebody and not like them is what I'm saying. So
yeah,
you could have somebody who you find, well, let's just to use kind of a silly example, if you had to choose between two people who you're going to go out and have dinner with after work today, is it going to be the abrasive jerk who cusses all the time and, to insult your wife and whatever the case may be? Obviously not, right? You're going to choose somebody who you like and you get along with, maybe this coworker actually that you just talked about, who you're friends with. You'd rather spend time with that person. The reality is, if you have somebody on your team who you don't particularly like, who knows how long that person's going to be there? You have two options. You can either not serve them, which hurts everyone on your team, or you can help bring out the best in them. And something I've seen, particularly, I guess the system is part and parcel of it, is that if you create the right environment, you'd be amazed at how people who you didn't like initially transform and become somebody who's an amazing team player and who you might end up liking. So I think that's something, coming back to kind of the nobody wants to be mediocre. If we as leaders create the right environment, I believe anybody can succeed with a few exceptions, right? I mean, you have to have some basic modicum of intelligence, some basic modicum of not being a psychopath. There are obvious constraints here, right? But generally speaking, anyone, who kind of passes the basic requirements for getting a job, you put them in the right environment and they can succeed. And that's what this process is about, is how do you create that environment where people are going to succeed?
So I really want to dive. I'd like to have you dive deep on that. I don't agree with you that everybody wants to succeed. I do think there are some people that just want to get by, and some people that want to even cheat and, want to cheat the system and just try to make it appear they're getting by or doing the work, but they're not really. But I don't want to stay there. I'm really interested. So this environment that you're suggesting we create for people, then how do you do that when you have to kind of fight some internal feelings, emotions, fears that, I don't necessarily believe in this person, or I don't like this particular behavior of the person, or whatever it might be. How do you adjust? Maybe if you've got a story of a client you worked with or yourself, how do you adjust to create that environment? I totally agree with you, but how do you adjust yourself to create the environment, and then what does the environment look like?
Well, now that might be a good segue into kind of going back to the monastery experience, because I do think there's some, if we have some capacity for agility, that's a really important piece here, right? But in a general sense, to me, it all comes down to, it helps to have a little bit of outside motivation at first. So if you understand, okay, whether my motivation is purely to get results, or my motivation is because I'd like more meaning in my life, I think either way, when we create an environment where people succeed, we can win. And so I think that's where it starts, right? If a person doesn't believe either of those things, like if they think, well, yeah, I'm not going to find any more meaning at work by helping people succeed, and I really don't care if my team does well, then of course there's nothing we can do. That person probably shouldn't be in a management position. But assuming the basic idea, if somebody is confronted with the truth that your work will be much more meaningful if you're not self-centered and only focused on your own short-term self-interest, and much more concerned, or at least equally concerned, about how you bring out the best in your team, the worst case scenario is that you go home every day fulfilled and you have much more meaning in your work. And at first, you may not be like, I'm actually very introverted. I'm a very transactional person by nature, and I'm terrible at that stuff. But what I notice is I believe that this is what makes life meaningful. And every time I move in this direction, that belief is reaffirmed, and I get more and more evidence of, wow, this is worth doing for multiple reasons, and I get better at it.
So, I'm curious about one thing. So sure. You mentioned, like, if you just don't care about people, you're self-centered. But doing this will be more meaningful for you. I got that right, correct?
I think so.
Yeah. So then, have you also found that if you're in a different situation and life's throwing you some curveballs and you're depressed, you're feeling not good enough, have you found that when leaders who struggle with that go out and stop focusing inward, but do what you were talking about, focusing outward, that actually can help them move out of that space into a healthier space by going and helping someone on their team, whether they feel they bond with them easily, or maybe they have difficulty bonding with them. Have you ever seen that?
Absolutely. And in fact, that's kind of my personal story as well. That's what provides the most powerful evidence of all, right? When you're, sometimes life circumstances or health for some reason can lead to a bout of depression, and you're feeling terrible, and you realize, wow, if I get out of my own my own self-pity, let's say, and out of wallowing in this depression, and I extend myself a little bit to help somebody, holy cow. I mean, you feel better immediately. It's like running. It's like if you're feeling kind of depressed, I challenge you, go run 5 miles and tell me how you feel after that. You're going to be sore. You may say, oh, that sucked. It wasn't pleasant. But I guarantee you're not depressed for the next hour or two after you run 5 miles. And it's very similar to that. And that's kind of how I stumbled upon all this. I being self-centered and transactional, I took a shortcut to success when I was a young man, just a few years out of college, and I attempted a fraud against the government. I had these big, ambitious goals that I wanted to hit, and an opportunity kind of, I hate to use that term, but it essentially fell in my lap. I wasn't looking for it. It was just something kind of presented itself. And at first I didn't entertain that I would ever do something like that, but I ended up taking a couple steps to arrange a fraudulent delivery of government funds. I abandoned it, but I had taken enough steps to be guilty of a fraud, and I ended up spending 5.5 years in prison as a result of doing several dishonest things and being pretty stupid and short-sighted. And at first, I mean, I was 24 and a half. I was dating this beautiful Brazilian model. I mean, I was surfing, doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu, playing golf. I had such this party life. And I mean, to then go sit in a prison cell, and I was basically in solitary confinement for the first, almost the first year. I mean, I was suicidal at first. I mean, it was the worst experience of my life, hands down. But very fortunately for me, I guess it was about a year in, maybe 11 months, 12 months, I started learning about mindfulness training, and just through books. I was just reading about, you can train the mind to be more happy, to be more at peace. And it made a lot of sense. It's very logical. And I'm kind of a logical person. If it makes sense to me, I'm going to try it. I had nothing better to do, right? I'm just sitting in a prison cell. So I start training mindfulness, which is the idea is very simple. You're just aware of your own mind and body throughout an activity, whether it's sitting or walking or brushing your teeth or whatever. And after about 6 months of practice, I was making the effort to be mindful during just about every waking moment of my day. And it was around that time, 6 months after I started practice, where I noticed, oh my gosh, I'm happier here in prison with no possessions, no girlfriend, no nothing than I'd ever been in my life. And it seemed kind of weird to me actually at first, but it also was very intriguing. So I'd been learning about books that were written by monks. So I said, well, I'm going to go as far as I can with this, and I'm going to live and train exactly as monks live and train. And I spent the last 3.5 years of my time in confinement basically living exactly how a monk would live in a monastery. But I call it like a monastery on steroids, because in a real monastery, which I've lived in as well, we might get to that, but people are very nice. Everyone talks quietly. It's very peaceful. This monastery, you look wrong at somebody, they're going to try to shank you the next day. So you have prison guards who treat you like an animal. And so you get to deal with anger and frustration and people that you don't like all the time. And so this kind of comes back to some of the questions you were asking. So here's where it gets really strange. You're going to think I was institutionalized or became institutionalized when I say this. But when I left, there was no boundary between inside the walls and outside the walls. If you would have told me you need to spend the rest of your life here, I would have said, no problem, without batting an eye. And here's why. Because the big shift for me was not so much, I learned how to be happy with nothing, which, by the way, anyone can do. This is completely repeatable and trainable. But where the big shift for me came was when I realized how much impact I could make on the lives of others in that place with no power, no authority, just being a prisoner like everyone else. I was asked every single day, because I looked so happy, what drugs are they giving you, dude? Like what's going on? Right? And so I had an opportunity every day to help somebody. And not just other inmates, but prison guards, people who I might not have liked very much. But I knew if I could help that person to be a little bit happier, maybe they go home and they don't hit their wife tonight. Maybe they actually have a nice conversation with her, and maybe they treat her better and their kids better. And I could envision this ripple effect of people leaving, inmates who left before me, prison guards going home, treating their families better. I could see how I could literally change communities, if not the planet, from inside of a prison cell or a prison system, just by adding value, bringing out the best in these people, helping them to be the best version of themselves.
Yeah, but that came from somewhere else. And by the way, I do have a reference point, because back in like 1981, 82, I was Prison Fellowship's first volunteer director for San Francisco Bay Area. And I went into San Quentin prison every once a week, almost every night, every week. Rarely missed a week for a year. And a lot of times it was solitary, because they were fighting.
Right.
They're on lockdown, so they only get out once a week for a shower or something like that. It was really bad. So I understand that, but please talk more to the audience about this mindfulness. So we live in a world where we are constantly assaulted with stimuli temptations. Let me call it that. It can be advertising. It can be YouTube. It can be a text. It can be instant messaging. It can be email. It can be people, whatever it is. But man, it's never been this crazy on the senses. And
You're right.
when, at least the prison, San Quentin, that I visited, it wasn't like quiet monastery time. I mean, the at that time it was portable radios and cassette tapes or whatever, but it was loud music 24 hours a day in the cells. You're in a cell block. There's 5 stories high. There's 50 cells, I think, per story, per type of thing. And it's just craziness. And how did you get mindful and get yourself in that place where you then were so solid that you were able to focus on others?
Well, that's the big insight that comes out of mindfulness training, is that we tend to think that things will be just fine when the external world is just fine. And that's a pretty faulty assumption. So if we start with the assumption that, well, if I just did this, if I just fixed this, if my environment was just a little bit quieter, if I had just a little bit less noise, then everything would be fine. It's not true. I mean, what is true is that if you can be free from your thinking, then it doesn't matter what happens in the external world, with some minor exceptions of like really extreme pain or suffering of some type. But generally speaking, for most people, it doesn't matter what happens. If you train your mind in the right way, what happens in the external world is irrelevant. And it really comes down to just recognizing that thoughts are not what we are. We tend to believe that we are the thoughts in our head. I'm that voice in my head talking to myself, right? And it's the extent to which we believe that we're in trouble. Because if our thoughts go negative, then we suffer. If our thoughts are positive, we might feel good. We're just kind of a victim of our thoughts. And just to a great extent, we have really no control over what thoughts arise in our heads. I mean, over time, you can gradually change your thinking, but moment to moment, I could put any thought I want in your head right now. You have no control over it, right? So the true freedom is recognizing that thoughts are a tool, and they're a very powerful tool. They're very helpful, but it's not what we are. And a simple thought experiment bears this out very, very quickly, right? So most people can't imagine this, but let's just imagine that you were sitting still in a quiet room and there were no thoughts in your head. The inner voice was totally silent, no mental images. It's just emptiness, right? And then all of a sudden a thought comes up. Now, maybe it's about pizza, or maybe it's about a party, or whatever, but it's some great thought. And then it goes away and you're back to empty mind, no thought. So this tells us a very important lesson, right? Because I think we would all agree that even when there was no thinking, there was experience. You could hear things, you could see things, you could feel things. You still exist. You're there. Then a thought comes up, you're still there. Then the thought goes away, you're still there. So this tells us that this thought is not what we are. This is something that arises and passes away on its own accord. And ultimately, what mindfulness training is about is shifting one's perspective so that we become the observer and the listener to thoughts as a habit, instead of that. Sometimes occasionally happens, right? Like you're about to say something rude, you catch yourself, you're like, oh, I shouldn't say that out loud. Guess what that was? That was you having an objective view of your thought. You heard that voice and you said, that is not something that should be said out loud at this time. And you let that thought go, right? So we all know what being mindful is. It's just most of us spend most of our time identified with thoughts instead of seeing them objectively. And so what the practice is about is just learning to spend more and more time simply being aware of what's happening in one's body and in one's mind, seeing thoughts objectively. And when we train in this way, even in the busyness, we can find peace. And that's where we get really good evidence of how powerful this could be. Even with device use, for instance, if I have a device, there's 2 ways that I can use it. One is where it's in control of me. Every time a notification goes off, I stop what I'm doing and I check it. Or I can be extremely intentional and I can say, which is basically what I do, is I have my phone on silent almost all the time. I check it once an hour on a break. Do I have any texts that need to be responded to? No. And so I use the device the same way everyone else does. I do texts, I do emails, I do social media to some extent, but I'm very intentional about it. And when I pick up my phone, I'm aware of what's happening in my mind and my body. I'm not on autopilot. And that's drastically different, I think, to how most people are reacting to their devices. So this is where I think if we set up some intentionality, having that foundation is really powerful. Even aside from the mind training, I think that's where the monastic training was so helpful, is creating habits that set you up for success. And I think if you talk to, I don't claim to be an extremely successful person, but if you talk to most successful people by both metrics, where they're both happy and they've had business success, you'll find a pattern that they get a lot of important stuff done very early on in the day, and then they delay stupid stuff as late as possible in the day.
Yeah.
So like for me, for instance, my priorities are I wake up in the morning, and the very first thing I do after I go to the bathroom and drink some water is I sit down and train my mind for 25 minutes. I just sit and do exactly what we just talked about, where I just observe the body and the mind. You can call it prayer, you can call it meditation. I don't care what you call it. It's just basically being still and observing yourself. And then once my body's waking up, my mind's waking up, I go exercise. And while I'm exercising, I'm learning something. I'm listening to a podcast. I'm listening to an audiobook. I'm listening to a talk at a conference on startups, whatever the case may be. And I do all that before my kids wake up in the morning. So before my kids even woke up, I've done what I think are the most important things that you can do. I've gotten a good night's sleep. I've trained my mind in mindfulness. I've exercised my body and learned something before 5:30 in the morning. And so that sets me up, I think, for success, which makes it a lot easier. So, mind training is tricky, but if you have a foundation like that, it becomes a little bit easier.
Now, do you also control your morning that way too? In other words, once you get the kids out of bed, off to school, whatever it might be, and then you start your workday, what type of things do you put in the front end of your day, the morning of your day, because you feel those are more important versus
Absolutely. Yep.
putting aside the other stuff? So what types of things are in your morning?
It's all the higher priority things, right? But generally, as much as possible, I try to focus on what I call deep work. So these are things, if anybody, I forgot the author, I think it's Cal Newport. There's an excellent book, which I actually read after I started this habit, but it's a great reminder. And there's a lot of really good tools in that book. I highly recommend it. But I try to focus on building assets, whether it's a written piece of content, a video piece of content, something that I'm not. So we've probably all heard of the Stephen R. Covey, the priority matrix, right? Where you've got things that are urgent and important. You've got things that are urgent but not important. You've got things that are not important, not urgent, and you can fill in the blank. I forgot which ones I've said already, but obviously, if something's important and urgent, that should be done right away. But I think where we get stuck is we tend to focus a lot on stuff that seems urgent but really isn't that important. And then there's things that are important but not urgent. And I think that's where we're building assets for the future. So something that, does it have to happen this week? No. But if I don't have time on my calendar blocked off every day to work on the important but not urgent, it's probably never going to happen. So I have that time blocked off, and generally it is things that are more like content, but sometimes it's culture related stuff because we tend to put that off too, right? We're dealing with customers, we're dealing with this, we didn't hit our revenue target, we're having trouble meeting cash flow, whatever the fire is that we're putting out. All of a sudden a month goes by and we realize, I haven't put any thought into how we're improving our culture here, or how I could better serve the team that is necessary for this company to run well. And so, it's things that don't have to happen today, but if they never happen, I'm never going to be successful.
Well, I love what you say about asset building. So the asset building happens in the morning. So I'm trying to do a process where I spend an hour and a half each morning in doing some writing that I'm trying to get done.
Right.
And so that's asset building.
Exactly.
But then you look at, that's kind of before kids are up, things are happening. But then I'm thinking you're sparking thoughts with me that I need to start looking at, okay, what about between 8 and noon, or at least 8 and 10, or 8 and 11? Where else can I be putting my asset building in there? And I can push back some other coaching calls or meetings to later in the day, kind of the 10 to 2 spot or the 11 to 3 spot. So I've got that asset building that's always happening, because that's what I've found gets lost.
Exactly. And then, that's where the big movements happen, right?
Oh, yeah.
And one of my favorite examples is Warren Buffett. So arguably, by Western standards, among the most productive human beings that we've seen. I mean, he's built a company that previously was valued at $1 trillion. I think it's a little bit shy of that now because of market conditions. But Berkshire Hathaway hit $1 trillion market cap at one point. If you look at Warren Buffett's calendar, I mean, it's empty almost all the time. It might have like one thing on it the whole week: get a haircut. He takes almost no meetings. He does almost no urgent stuff. He spends almost all of his time reading and thinking. Now, most of us don't have that luxury, right? So I'm not saying we can do that, but there's a balance. There's somewhere between Warren Buffett, who literally does nothing 98% of the time, but when he does something, it moves the needle incredibly, right? Somewhere between him and the average person they look really busy. Like if you were to grade people on activity, they're an A+. But if you grade them on what did they actually produce, they're failing. Why? Because they're working on the wrong stuff. They're constantly tied up with things that are urgent but not important. And if we take time to build an asset, if we have that on our calendar, it might take 6 months to build something of value. But a book is a great example. I'm actually working on another one right now. And that's a process, right? You can't just write a book in a week unless you're my friend John Gordon. He does that every December. He writes a book in about a month. But most of us don't have that luxury. We're running companies or we're doing this. So it's a process. And if you don't block that time off, next year never comes, right? It's like, I'll get to it then. I'll get to it then. It just never comes. But if you just say like what you're doing, well, I'm going to take 2 hours a day to work on this. 7 months later, look at what you have. You have an asset.
But I have to do it first thing in the morning, like you brought up.
Right.
Because if I don't, it's toast.
Right, exactly. Because once you do that a day, it's hard not to be responding to stuff that needs to be responded to. And that's where I think even if you're intentional about those first 2 hours, like for me, it's like that 8:30 to 11-ish time frame. I try to never schedule a meeting unless it's absolutely like some amazing client. That's the only time they can meet. Or if it's a team member that really needs something and that's, it's super urgent for them. Other than that, I don't take meetings before 11 o'clock. And I don't even check email unless I had to go send one and I might catch something while I'm in there. But I'm working on stuff that I think I've predetermined either the day before or the week before. I've already determined that this is important, but not urgent. This fits into my long-term strategy for creating growth and making the impact that we want to make. And I've predetermined that I'm going to do these things. And that's when I do that.
I love it. So I want to go back to mindfulness.
Okay.
And you talked about thinking and that your thoughts are not who you are. And my understanding is that people that practice mindfulness it really helps them whether they do it independent of some type of spiritual faith, or speaking to your monastery, they do it as part of their spiritual faith. Mm-hmm. Have you seen a difference at all between the two? Is one more focused? Because I heard you talk about it, I was thinking about, as a Christ follower, I'm thinking of, I need to be engaging with the spirit that's available to me more often versus the thought comes in and I act.
Right.
Okay. And I'm not a mindfulness expert. I need to focus on it better. So I really have enjoyed the conversation. But I'm curious, and I'm not saying this is bias. You can say people without faith are actually they're stronger. Whatever. I'm just curious, have you seen that it's the same either way? Or have you seen a difference between people who it's tied to some type of spiritual beliefs or just a belief in something greater than themselves, something they want to achieve?
Yeah,
versus people who are just mindful and kind of understanding themselves.
Yep. I did that last that last distinction is an important one. And the answer is that anyone will get some benefit, right? If you, at its essence, the practice is just sitting still and stopping being the thinker in your head. That's it. You're taking some time to be the listener. Who is it that listens to the thoughts in my head? And if you do have a faith background, if you come from the Christian faith or any theistic tradition, I mean, I think it's an extremely important practice. We spend all of our time talking. It's like you're going to tell God, who's infinitely wise, if you're a Christian, what you want or what you need. I mean, why don't you listen? I mean, you might find some pretty cool answers if you just listen. So it's a pretty cool shift. I'm not saying that that we shouldn't do some type of petition prayer. What I'm saying is that if we balance it with maybe doing a little bit of talking, but spending 90% of our time listening, I think there's a lot greater value there. But back to your main question, ultimately, I think to get the biggest benefit, it doesn't necessarily matter that you have a spiritual tradition, but it's that you have the right motivation, which is I'm motivated not just by how I can be a little bit happier or a little bit more at peace, but what that empowers me to do in the lives of others. Because if I know that I'm just a little bit more peaceful, a little bit less likely to be angry with my kids or my wife or my neighbor, that has a pretty important impact on the lives of others. I think there's pretty strong evidence, and I apologize, I can't think of a study right off the top of my head, but I could probably find it if I researched it for you. But I have plenty of anecdotal evidence of this, that when people are motivated by the aspiration to bring value in the lives of others, that in and of itself is cultivating the wisdom that sets you free. Because the wisdom that sets you free is not just the intellectual understanding. The thought experiment that we did, anybody can do that. In 30 seconds, you realize like, okay, yeah, obviously I'm not my thinking because it comes and goes. Have you ever had a thought that was there when you were 2 that has persisted from when you were 2 to your current age? No one has ever had that. So clearly you are not your thoughts, but that does you very little good. That intellectual understanding is just some motivation to go look in the right direction. What does you good is spending time just simply being, without being identified with your thoughts. So that means you're listening and observing. And when you make the shift to, I would like to be of service to others, or this effort is dedicated to be of service to others, that alone, that very motivation brings you out of egocentrism, which is by definition identifying with thought. So it's almost like a shortcut. And there are certain traditions actually where they view it's wisdom and compassion are basically equal in terms of helping you be free from your own suffering, your own thoughts.
Well, it also seems somewhat very consistent with the serenity prayer of, being able to be aware of what you can do something about and letting go of the other stuff.
Absolutely.
I'm not quoting it exactly. I'm not quoting it exactly right. The other thing I would say that you bring up that you alluded to, but I don't think you emphasize as much, is that if you're at peace and you're calm, you're going to be less stress. You're going to be happier. And you just look at the ages of some of our best comedians, Carol Burnett, Dick Van Dyke, they're all like 90 plus, because they're laughing and they're letting stuff go and they're more at peace and they've been successful that way. So I think this has been fabulous, Matt. I would love to keep going, but I know that you've got stuff going on and we've got to leave now. But where can people learn more about you and what you're doing?
I'm pretty Googleable. So if you go to Google and type in Matt Tenney, you'll find lots of good stuff. It's Tenney.
Okay. Well, that's great. Well, thank you again so much for being on the show. Really enjoyed the conversation. I think some great tips for our audience here.
Thanks for having me, David. I enjoyed the conversation as well.
Thanks for joining us today. If you liked the episode with Matt, please leave us a comment or a rating. Love to get your feedback. Don't forget Habitly.com, where you can learn how to be the best you with other people, achieve your dreams, have the relationships you want, build the career and the life that you want to have. Habitly.com. Can't go wrong. Thanks again for being here. And we got more great guests coming, but bye for now.